Hi there. In this video, I'm going to show you some super dry magic. This is magic. You can find it at github.com/polterguy/magic. There's a link in the description of this YouTube video to where you can download it. Of course, dry is an acronym and implies don't repeat yourself. Magic brings this very important architectural design principle to a new level, where you end up with a micro framework that allows you to literally create your database apps and wrap them into ASP.NET Web API controller endpoints without writing a single line of code. And Magic uses Swashbuckle or Swagger UI internally, which even implies that your REST API will be automatically documented. Already, without doing anything but clicking F5 in Visual Studio, we have our web API. And it is capable of persisting into a database. Of course, the default database is an SQLite database, but you can easily modify it to either be MySQL or MS SQL by simply editing this part of your app settings.json. So let's extend it. First thing we want to do, we want to start out with our model. Let's create a new domain type or model, and let's call it foo. Okay, rename to foo. Notice I copied and pasted my todo.cs file. Then I'm gonna have one field in my domain type called bar. Then I need to copy and paste the to-do map.cs file and name it foo map.cs. Rename the class to foo-map, pass in foo, it's my generic argument, rename the constructor. Notice also, importantly, you have to change obviously the tables, but you also get the ID for free here. The reasons why I will show you in a second, after I have mapped up my bar property towards my database table. We go back to foo here, you see it inherits from model. Model contains our ID. So now, by editing our foo-map.cs file to look like this, we're now done with our model. Then, let's move on to our contracts. Open up magic.contracts.todo and copy I-to-do service, rename it to I-foo service, open it, rename the interface to I-foo service, make sure you pass in foo as your generic argument here. Then we need to implement our service, and we do that by copying the to-do service, rename it to foo service, open it, rename the actual class to foo service, pass in foo here, and make sure you implement I-foo service. Then rename the constructor, and since we have logging for free, we probably want to change the type of logging we're actually doing by changing this thing in the base constructor invocation. We're now done with our service layer. Now we can start creating our view model. Open up magic.web.model.todo, copy todo.cs, rename it into foo.cs, open it, rename the class to foo, keep the ID, remember we inherited it, then change for instance, the header to bar. And we're done with our view model. Now we can do our controller. Copy that to do controller.cs, rename it to foo controller.cs, open it up. Make sure you change first its route to foo, then its name. Then make sure you use your view model named foo and your database model named foo, and then also rename its constructor and make sure you change the service to ifoo service. Then we need to use kernel.bind, which is an inject behind the scene, to bind between an ifoo service interface to our foo service implementation. And believe it or not, but we're done. And simsalabim, abracadabra, we have created Web API REST endpoint. Arguably, without coding a single line of code. We now have access to 6 REST HTTP endpoints to do all CRUD operations on our foo database table. Get, put, post, get the list or an ID, delete, and count. Let's first count how many items we have in our database, and notice yet again, we automatically have documentation. We have 0 items, obviously. Let's put one in. Let's do another count this time, which will obviously return 1 item, and so on. How does this work? Well, first of all, our actual Web API project doesn't contain a single controller. That's point 1. All the controllers are dynamically loaded up in startup.cs at this line 49. This one is reading the plugins section from appsettings.json, what you can see here, which is basically just a list of assemblies. Magic.web.controller.todo happens to be a controller here, and it just automatically maps up every single controller we have here. Our controller, though, doesn't have a single method. Where did the REST method comes from? Well, we inherited them from CRUD controller. Here are our REST endpoints. Here you can see create, get, and here you can also see the documentation. List, update, and so on. Our service didn't contain a single method. How is the controller able to use our service? Well, our service is inheriting from CRUD service, passing in the database model. And CRUD service just so happened to be a generic class that internally uses and hibernates, Fluent and Hibernate to be specific, and is able to map from our database model and retrieve items from our database and return them back as a view model back to the caller. And our model, of course, is using Fluent and Hibernate, allowing us to dynamically declare our model and actually have Fluent and Hibernate automatically create our database to fit our class model. And all of this happened without us having to write a single line of code. And of course, at this point, if I want to override any particular point, let's say I open up my services, for instance, and I, for some reasons, want to modify the count implementation in my service to always return can +1, or override the list to make sure the caller never retrieves more than 10 items. Then I can do so. And I can override any point I wish in this micro framework, if you want to refer to it as such a thing, including my controller endpoints too. I can add to my controller anything I want to. If I want to have another HTTP REST endpoint, I can add it, or I can override my existing endpoints. List, for instance. Now I've overridden my list HTTP REST endpoint. And so on, and so on, and so on. So this allows us to literally wrap our database and create all CRUD operations for our domain types without having to write a single line of code. And that's magic. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.